And joining me now to discuss the topic further, good friend of the program, Dr. Jeremy Levitt, a FAMU professor of international law in Orlando. And thanks, as always, for joining me, Jeremy.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be with you, Fred.
We got a lot to talk about tonight. We heard what President Trump had to say from the Rose Garden a little bit earlier, from the White House a little bit earlier, about mobilizing U.S. military forces. That would, tell me if I'm wrong, wouldn't that involve the Insurrection Act, which was like 213 years old in order to do that?
I don't think he has any idea about what he's talking about, quite frankly. The U.S. president can only mobilize U.S. forces for operations in foreign territories and or on federal lands. What he's trying to do is coerce America's governors to do what he wants them to do, because of course he knows the local condition far better than they do. And what he wants to do is see some enormous use of force to mute these protesters, and it's simply not going to happen. And if he does deploy them unlawfully, then it's up to Congress and the judicial branch to put a check on them. He has 2 million soldiers at his disposal, and if he begins to use them unlawfully, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the military have to tell him no, quite frankly, because they know the Constitution better than the president. So this is outrageous. He also, if you listen carefully, used a phrase referring to the Second Amendment, which was a type of dog whistle almost to armed militias. And that really concerns me, because he continues to dog whistle and give cover to organizations that have a history of violent white extremism to take actions. And these are some of the outsiders we're seeing come in who are actually shooting at black people. And so he's not discussing that narrative. He's more concerned with Antifa.
Well, and what people really want and are looking for right now is leadership. You have chaos because there doesn't seem to be any cohesive marching orders to go by. Am I correct with that?
Yeah, well, the president lacks the emotional intelligence and the aptitude to understand the gravity of the moment. And what he's not realizing, this is not even just a domestic moment, but this is an international moment. The whole world is looking. He's been condemned by the United Nations. Police brutality has been condemned by the United Nations. There are people protesting in Paris and Copenhagen and Rio de Janeiro and Milan and Toronto and Vancouver and Mexico City and Lagos and London and Krakow, Poland, Perth, Berlin, Auckland, South Africa, even Syria, where they're fighting a war. There are people protesting against the killing of George Floyd and this president. And so he's on the wrong channel. He's a dangerous man.
Well, and when you look at it, the one way to make the demonstrations kind of taper down a little bit, at least in Minneapolis, would be to do something with those other 3 officers that were involved. What are your thoughts about what's going to happen with them?
They're going to have to do something. It's either going to have to be the Department of Justice or the local authorities. There's one point that no one in major media is discussing with respect to why this might be taking time. You know, there are certain police holds that require 2 or 3 people, and the positions that the other 2 are in were lawful positions. It was the knee on the neck that was unlawful. Whether the arrest was lawful was a different question. Whether they were co-conspirators because they stood by is another question. But there's something more permissive here, and that is that they may be looking at whether or not these other police officers will be witnesses against the primary offender who's already been arrested for murder. And so they have to navigate those waters very carefully, because their case is stronger if they have a witness that is a police officer. So there's probably some things going on behind the scenes related to certain pleas in this context.
And Jeremy, what is your take on the conflicting autopsy results? And if we are to go with the independent result, which says a homicide was committed here, could we possibly see the Chauvin, however you pronounce his name, his charge being elevated from 3rd-degree murder to possibly 2nd?
No, because what the outside autopsy is for is really for the civil litigation that will take place. This is what personal injury lawyers do on a regular basis. They want a different narrative. You know, the coroner's narrative is what the certainly what the defense will use. The prosecution will probably use both, one to contradict the other to the extent that they can do that. But this is really going to be used for the civil case against the police department, and also to shave the narrative that Mr. George didn't die from asphyxiation in the same way that every person who's watched it has witnessed it.
All right, he is Jeremy Levitt, esteemed professor of law at FAMU down in Orlando. Thank you so much, my friend. We'll speak again soon.
My pleasure, Fred.
All right, take care.